Hi, I'm Becky Tippett. I'm the Director of Carolina Demography, which is at the Carolina Population Center, and we are an applied demographic consulting service that works with both faculty and projects internal to the university as well as external clients. I'll be talking a little bit today about kind of aggregate census data, and I'll turn it over to Bert to introduce himself, and then we'll go around.
If I'm introducing myself now, I'm Bert Greiger. I am the administrator of the Research Data Center that's currently located on the Duke campus. There will soon be a new location also open on the UNC campus. I'm an economist with the U.S. Census Bureau and have been doing this job for 13 years now. And I just hope to provide the attendees with some information on how they can access confidential versions of census data, as well as confidential versions of data sets from other agencies that partner with Census on the RDCs.
Thank you. And then we'll go Ted and Michelle. And just a brief announcement again for the attendees who might have missed this. We're having a bit of a Zoom technical difficulty. Right now, video is limited to me, and we'll try to troubleshoot it if we can. So, Ted.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, great. Yes. I'm Ted Ma. I'm a sociologist, both in the sociology department and at CPC, and I'll be the director of the UNC branch of the data center when it opens, and I do research on labor markets and inequality and immigration with census related data.
Hi, I'm Michelle Hazlett. I'm the librarian for numeric data services and data management in Davis Library. I'm able to help people figure out if data are available publicly to meet their research needs before they need to go to the research data center.
Great. So the way that this is going to work is I'm going to do a bit of a brief overview on kind of what we know about Census 2020, but also level set with some terminology and concepts about what we can get publicly, which can maybe help highlight some of the gaps that the restricted use data might fill, because they're the sorts of questions that you can't answer publicly. Then I'm going to turn it over to Bert, and we'll have some time to take questions at the end, but we could obviously also take questions in the chat. So feel free to put questions in kind of the Q&A or in the chat as works out. Okay, so, and to my fellow panelists, once I'm done with this, I will continue to try to troubleshoot the video sharing challenge. So, Before I go into census data, I just want to talk a little bit about Carolina Demography so that you know, much like Michelle is a resource, Carolina Demography is also a resource. I'm going to go over some key concepts. Then I want to talk specifically about the 2020 census and what we know about North Carolina, so you get a sense of what's going on in the state. And last, I'm going to talk specifically about race and ethnicity in the 2020 census, because I think it highlights one of those ways in which the RDC could be very useful for examining really key concepts of interest. So Carolina Demography is located in the Carolina Population Center, and we really exist to help individuals and organizations around the state answer the question, where is North Carolina heading? While our work is not limited to North Carolina, it is predominantly focused in the state. And we do that through a variety of ways. So we're kind of work with data acquisition, as well as data creation, and data analysis and interpretation. So we do a lot of work around synthetic estimates or projections. Then also a significant amount of communication and translation. So taking that information and making it public and sharing out in a way that's accessible to maybe a non-technical or non-academic audience. So there are some ways that if you wanted to get a sense about how we're using census data or the sorts of publicly available data that are in the state, just wanted to highlight some of the ways that you can kind of follow along or work with us. So you can obviously read our blog, that's at ncdemography.org. You can follow us on Twitter. You can also ask us a question directly. And this is where, while we do a lot of work closely with the library system and Michelle and her team, we also do a lot of work with microdata. So some of the publicly available microdata. And then last, subscribing to our newsletter. So before I talk specifically about what happened in the 2020 census, I want to go over some key census concepts that I think will also, again, inform what the RDC can do. So when we're talking about the census and we're talking about census geographies, we're often talking about these geographies that run down the center are called the spine geographies, and everything else is off spine. So the ones down the center are kind of often statistical geographies like census blocks or block groups. And the ones off the center are more administrative or political boundaries. And so what we have here is when we're thinking about the data that is publicly available, it exists kind of in these predetermined geographies. And so if you are really interested in detailed data, the most detailed place that you can get for total population counts, some population details, and some housing unit details is at the census block level. It's very limited, only available kind of once a decade. And the challenge here also is that these geographies change over time. So every 10 years, when we do the decennial census, the geographies are kind of rebounded to account for population change and keeping kind of the statistical qualities there. And so this can make it a little bit challenging to do change over time. And it's also going to constrain exactly how the data is made available because it's going to come in these predetermined kind of prepackaged boundaries. Some of our detailed characteristics like socioeconomic characteristics, such as education and income, are going down to the block group level. And you'll see these geographies in a lot of the census data products. Obviously, there's a lot of data products from the Bureau, and I'm talking mainly about the population-focused ones, like the American Community Survey and the decennial census. A couple other things that you want to be aware of is that when we're talking about the Census Bureau data, there's really kind of three key data products that tell us about population. So we have the 2020 census, which is the decennial census. That's done every 10 years. It's every person living in the 50 states, DC, and the territories. It's a small set of questions starting in 2010 that just captures kind of key demographic information. It's the official count of population, and it goes down to the block level. Now we also have the American Community Survey. This has been fully implemented since 2006, and it's conducted every month of every year. The difference between the American Community Survey, or ACS, is that the American Community Survey is a sample. Compared to a 100% count, it's a small sample of the population, but it gives us really rich information like detailed social and economic topics, so things like education, employment, internet access, and transportation. But it's really better used for population characteristics like percents, means, medians, and rates rather than counts, because it's not the official count of the population. And when we look at the American Community Survey, the smallest geography we have there is the block group. So it's one level up from the block, and that's only available in kind of the 5-year average file. So it's not available annually, while areas with 65,000 people or more are available once a year or updated on an annual basis. The other data element that you might hear about are population estimates. So these are not a count, they're not a sample, they're derived from administrative records such as birth and death certificates, and migration derived from international immigration files and like IRS tax records. So unlike the decennial census or the American Community Survey, you would not find the population estimates in the RDC because it's not a census or a survey product. And the population estimates tell us about the total characteristics of a population, how and why it's changing by net migration or natural increase. And the population estimates are the official count of the population in between the census years. And they're used to kind of be the weighting or the population totals for the American Community Survey. Of course, these only go down to the county level. So this is kind of some of the big products that I use. Bert's going to talk in much more detail about some of the different types of data available in the RDC. You can already see here that even in the publicly available data, there's a lot of variation in both the detail and the geographic specificity that you can get access to. So wanted to touch very quickly on what we know about the census for 2020 in North Carolina. So this slide has been changing over the last 6 months because some of the information on here has been updated. So right now, what we know are total populations and selected characteristics from the 2020 census. We don't yet know information like detailed age structure or home ownership. We also know that it was highly accurate overall. The demographic analysis estimates from the Bureau estimated a 0.3% undercount. A recent evaluation using a synthetic model from the Urban Institute suggests maybe a 0.5% undercount. But overall, we also saw that the population estimates produced prior to the census were generally in line with the census counts. So these values all suggest that it was a highly accurate census. Not as accurate as 2010 or 2000, but significantly closer to those numbers than we expected because of the impact of the pandemic. What we don't yet know are things like the differential undercount or which groups were more or less likely to be counted. We also know that all North Carolina congressional districts will need to be redrawn. And what I used to have here was that we didn't know where those seats would go, but that changed last week. In North Carolina, I think the big question now is whether or not we're going to keep those maps for the next decade or if we're going to redistrict multiple times. So when we look at 2020 census in North Carolina, we have a total resident population of 10,439,388, which is a growth of nearly 904,000 or 9.5% since 2010. We were also one of six states to gain at least one seat in the House of Representatives. The census is vital for our state's fair share of the more than $1.5 trillion federal dollars that are allocated annually. In fiscal year 2017, that was $44 billion to North Carolina. These are just kind of the standard federal programs, and I'm not including anything that's specific to COVID relief in this amount. Other new topics that we got in the 2020 census for the first time were details on same-sex relationships and ancestry and origins data for all respondents. So when we look at North Carolina, when we look at our 100 counties, while our state grew overall, 51 of our state's counties actually lost population. And among the 49 counties that grew, that growth was heavily concentrated in the Triangle, in Wilmington, and in Charlotte. The fastest growing county over the decade was Johnston County, just outside of Wake, followed very closely by Brunswick, outside of Wilmington, and Cabarrus, outside of Mecklenburg or Charlotte. When we look at the counties in particular that lost population, this map shows the population by number of people lost. So all of the counties that are not yellow actually have significant population losses, with the largest numeric loss in our northeastern portion of the state and the Sandhills, with Robeson County in particular losing nearly 18,000 residents over the decade. Now, when we go back to the state's total population growth, it was a net gain of 904,000 residents between 2010 and 2020. Over that same time period, we saw a net increase of 2,654 children, while the adult population increased by more than 901,000. This means that virtually all of the state's growth was due to an increase in the adult population. And given fertility rates and population age structures, it's highly likely that North Carolina may have fewer children in 2030 than it does today. Now, when we look across our counties, you can see that the child population was lower in 2020 than it was in 2010 for nearly 3 in every 4 North Carolina counties. And even for our counties that had fast growth, the child population did not grow at the same pace. I want you to pay particular attention here to Brunswick County in the bottom southeast corner of the state. While that was the second fastest growing county in the state, has fewer children in 2020 than in 2010, because that growth is almost entirely due to retiree migration and not due to kind of working age or prime childbearing populations. The other big story that we have in the state, in addition to kind of age structure shifting, is one of increasing diversity. And this is both real diversity, but also some changes in how the population is asked about their racial and ethnic identification. So in 1990, 75% of the state's population identified as white non-Hispanic and 22% as Black non-Hispanic. Virtually all of the other groups were very much kind of spread across the other categories. Note here that all other races includes American Indian, multiracial, and other race. In 1990, that's predominantly American Indian, because multiracial was not introduced until the 2000 census. So in 2000, you see significant growth in the share of the state's population that's Hispanic or Latino, and growth in the all other races fueled by the introduction of the multiracial or check 2 or more race option on the form. In 2010, we see all other races hits 3%, again, continued growth in the Hispanic population. And while all of our populations are growing, they're kind of shifting the composition. Now, 2020, we see significant increase in the all other races category. The Asian population is also now at 3%, and our Hispanic population has grown significantly. So we're seeing this much more diverse population in 2020 than we did previously. When we look at the specific numeric change by race and ethnicity, the largest numeric increase was in the Hispanic population, followed by the multiracial population, and then by the Asian population. And here you can see that both Black and white populations grew, but much more slowly or much less than most of our other groups. We saw absolute declines in the American Indian population, but I haven't examined American Indian in combination with other groups to understand how much this is real or reflects some changing race questions that I'll talk about in a moment. When we look at the percent increase, the largest percent increase was in all other races. But if you go back here, you'll see numerically that was a relatively small increase. So we're talking about a small increase on a small base for a kind of 207% increase. The multiracial population also more than doubled. And among kind of the pre-existing groups that we've been monitoring, the Asian population was the fastest growing, followed by the Hispanic population. Now, I want to focus specifically on race and ethnicity in the 2020 census, because I think this highlights some of the ways in which there are new questions that are going to be emerging and are really the types of questions that are better suited to the restricted use data. So one of the changes that we saw in 2020 was, this is a standard question. We still had a separate Hispanic origin and separate race question. You can see here the Hispanic origin question in 2020, and now the race question. Now, the difference between 2020 on the right and 2010 on the left was that every single respondent to the census in 2020 was invited to put in a racial or ethnic origin. So whereas in 2010, if an individual responded white, they just checked, that was all they did. In 2020, they also then could write in specific races or origins that they identified as. Now, the other big difference was that in 2010, the Census Bureau captured up to 30 characters and only coded up to 2 groups, where in 2020, they captured up to 200 characters and coded up to 6 groups. Moreover, over the decade, more people who were completing the census had likely taken things like DNA tests that gave them more information on possible ancestries to put in. And unbeknownst to many people who completed the census, if you put in an ancestry, the Bureau then back-coded that into a racial classification. So specific ancestries were coded to specific races. For example, if you put Afrikaner, that was a white race. If you put South African, that was coded as a Black race. And you can see here, for example, if an individual had written in Aryan, they would have been classified as some other race. So even if they checked a specific race box, if the ancestry conflicted with that race box, they would now be classified as multiracial. So that's going to be informing that big increase that we see in the multiracial population. And I know researchers like me and others are really interested in how the specific relationship between race and ethnicity and ancestry and how this kind of influenced some of these categorization changes. as well as there's some real opportunities such as what Carolyn Liebler's done in Minnesota on linking across decennial censuses and understanding how people's identities change over time. So that's it for me. And I'm going to turn it over now to Bert to talk a little bit more about the data that you can access in an RDC and what you can get there. So Bert, are you able to share your screen?
Yeah, let me trying to get there. All right, can y'all see that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So did we ever get a sense of for the attendees? Did we ever get a sense of what departments they're with, or what type of data they'd be interested in? I mean, maybe we can ask them to put that in the chat.
Yeah, so if attendees can put in the chat kind of what they're interested in, Bert,
Well,
I can try to sum it.
I guess I can't get to the chat while I'm sharing, but if you can just holler out.
I'll summarize in an appropriate moment.
So, so what we were just looking at were what Census calls tabulations. So we publish tabulations that are collected from the ACS and from the decennial census. One other potential public source of data would be the public use microsamples, or what we call PUMS data. Those data are available through an outfit called IPUMS, and I think possibly to some extent available through Census directly. But what the RDC provides access to is confidential versions of the microdata. So the PUMS data I was just mentioning, the smallest level of geography that's available in those data is something called a PUMA. And I can't remember how many people average are in a PUMA, but the difference between that and what the data we have available is that you get the smallest level of geography that's actually recorded from the survey. So it's generally in most of our demographic data sets, like the ACS or decennial, you'll have the actual survey or census responses, and you'll know what census block those respondents live in. Other pieces of confidential information that are in our data would be things like exact dates of birth, exact dates of death, things like that. Not income responses that are not top coded. Those are the types of things that are confidential and that are available in our demographic data products that are not available in the PUMS data and are not available in tabular products like we were talking about before. So to step back a little bit, what are the RDCs? The RDCs provide an access point to data like I was just describing. They also provide access to data from other agencies that have partnered with Census. So National Center for Health Statistics, the Agency for Healthcare Research Quality, Bureau of Economic Analysis, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Not quite all of the BLS data are available to us, but a lot, like in particular, the NLSY data are available to us in the original cohort NLS samples. Those agencies make their data available to us or to researchers in the RDCs. Why do we care about having an RDC on the Carolina campus? Well, it's a convenient access point to actually go in and work with raw data that are confidential. And so having one on campus and UNC being a part of a consortium that they have been for a number of years, the advantage of that is that there is what we call a seat fee to access the RDCs. That fee is covered. by the fact that UNC is a member of the consortium along with Duke and RTI International. Previously, you would have had to go over to Duke to actually use the RDC. Hopefully in the next month or so, you'll be able to access it right off of Franklin Street. Now, depending on the agency, you may have to still pay a fee to the agency. So if you use NCHS data, they're going to charge a data recovery fee or cost recovery fee for creating your data set. But those fees are kind of minimal compared to like a standard RDC seat fee, which would oftentimes run $10,000 or $20,000. So we're not, if you're accessing at UNC, you're not going to be paying the $10,000 or $20,000. You may have to pay a few $1,000s a year to a specific agency. If you're using census data, however, there would be no fee from census, but a handful of the other agencies do charge a fee of some sort. To access the data, you would have to obtain a census security clearance, which we call special sworn status. There's a residency requirement associated with that. So if you're a professor and you're looking to hire an RA, you do want to be aware of the citizen or not. If the RA is not a citizen, which I know is an increasingly difficult question to ask, you do kind of need to know whether or not the potential RA is a citizen or not, because if they're not, they would have had to have lived in the US for free in the last 5 years, or we cannot process them for clearance. And again, that's just something you would want to be aware of. Here's the RDC network. There's over 30 locations around the country now. You can collaborate with people that might have access to another RDC. So if you have a collaborator at Cornell or lots of places, you can collaborate with them and work on the same project, accessing the same data, just from a different location. And there's a quick example of some of the collaborations that currently exist. And then there's the agencies that at least partially participate in the RDC program. We're always talking to other agencies about adding their data. There are 13 federal statistical agencies, and only roughly half of them currently have their data available in the RDC. Yeah, so did we ever get a sense of where people are coming from? Maybe let me see if I can go out and look at the chat real quick.
Sorry, Bert. Yeah, there were a couple of people that gave a response. So some interest in business information and kind of economics, as well as some interest in health, disease, and environment. So some particular interest in linking across data sets and over time as well.
Okay, so I'll just kind of quickly try to go through the whole thing here then. So we have data from 2 health agencies that are available. To apply for those, to use those data, you actually do not go through me, you go straight to those agencies. And the whole application process is about to change because of federal legislation that was passed a couple of years ago called the Evidence Act. And I think in early 2022, there's going to be a centralized website where you start the application process. And so when that starts, that should direct you straight to the health agencies for their data. But if you were going to talk to me, say the next few weeks, then I can give you the lowdown on what the general application process is, but for specific questions, they don't like me to answer questions for them. So I would basically just refer you to them. You identify what data set you want to use, and then talk to them directly. Those are the types of things that are restricted in the health data that you wouldn't be able to access in public data. The big thing for public health data is that most of the time, even the state identifier is not available. And so one big thing that you want to get in the health data is just the state identifier that allows you to do a lot of things that you can't do with public health data. Like I said, you get a specific diagnosis, you get specific dates of death and birth. And this is a really partial list of the data sets that they have available, mainly focusing on the main ones that people tend to use. So it's like the NHS data, which actually includes a physical examination every year for a panel that they follow. Then, if you've done health research, you're probably aware of the health interview survey. We now do have the drug use and health survey available, even though that's not a quote unquote NCHS data set. You can apply through NCHS data and now use those data in the RDC. We have had recent projects using the National Survey of Children's Health, which is it's not a panel, but it does interview separate waves of children every year. I think from age 6 or from birth to age 17. We have had a couple of groups using that recently. And there's some, in the interest of time, I'm not going to have time to talk about the examples that are here, but there are example projects from local researchers for each of the type of data set. The main data set from AHRQ is the MEPS, the Medical Expenditure Panel Survey. There's only a couple of years of that are linked to an insurance component, which there is a MEPS insurance component that's actually a business data set, a survey of businesses that's collected by Census, and there's a linked version of that, but it only covers a couple of years. So most people are just using the MEPS. And although recently there is a linked MEPS and National Health Interview Survey data set that you can request to use, and we have had a couple of researchers use that, including Paul Schaefer, who just graduated from the UNC a couple of years ago. So like I said, to apply for the health data set, you can contact those agencies directly. Their websites are pretty explanatory. They have a lot of, they basically tell you exactly what you need to do. Like I said, I can try to answer some general questions for you about that application process, but they really prefer me not to try to do that, and just instead to refer you to them. The BLS data, these are the surveys that are currently available in the RDCs in pretty much in order of how often they're used. The Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is the one we've historically had the most questions about, is still not available, unfortunately. And then note, if you want to use, say, the NLSY data in the RDCs, note that you're going to have to pay them $4,000 per year right now, and that's just kind of a set fee that they charge. So census data, we have kind of 4 types of data. One is the demographic data that we've kind of pretty much already talked about. What a lot of people don't realize is that half of the Census Bureau, including the part that I work in, collects data on businesses. And so we have an extensive collection of data sets on businesses, almost all of which are largely confidential because the fact that a business files a tax return is itself confidential. So there are really no public microdata products that are collected by the Census Bureau. There is the LEHD data, which links data based on unemployment insurance records. It links individuals with their employers and then follows them over time. And then there's a recently available data set that still hasn't been used a whole lot, that has data on, it's like university level data on their employment makeup, what kind of grants they work with, and what kind of firms they buy stuff from. Here's a list of the demographic data that's available in the RDCs. In addition to the ones we've already talked about, we have the current population survey, We don't have like every single supplement from the CPS available. We do have the March CPS or the ASEC, and then there's select supplements that can be asked for, and the basic CPS can also be used. There are some weird restrictions on that, but if you're interested on that, you can go to contact me and I can walk you through how to do that. We do have data from the SIP, from the National Crime Victimization Survey, a brand new data set called CJARS, which is Administrative Record System data from the criminal justice system. We have the American Housing Survey and the NCHS that I talked about. That data set was actually in National Center for Health Statistics data set until a few years ago when Census took over the data collection. You can link these products to other Census products. That's particularly good for the decennial. It's not so good if you're trying to link the CPS, say, to the ACS, because you're linking the survey to a survey. You're not going to end up with a whole lot of observations unless maybe you're looking at a really long time frame. But it is possible to link to census data with the PIC. It's also possible to break, if you have data of your own and you have either a social security number associated with that data or name and address, that something like that that Census can link with, you can bring that type of data in and link it to the Census data. That would incur a cost of roughly $20,000 probably. But just be aware that that's okay. We do have the Numident file, which comes from Social Security records. It importantly contains the date of death that can be useful when you're looking at various outcomes. And we do have a master address file. In the census data, the microdata we have, you're never going to see anybody's address, but we do have links where the address is not actually provided, but you can link people across time using the address file. The business data, since we had somebody who's interested in that, every 5 years, Census conducts what we call the economic census. It tries to, like it says, tries to do a census of every business in the country, or at least employer-based businesses. And so most people are aware of who work with such data are aware of things like the census of manufacturers, the census of retail trade. But there's like 8 or 9 elements of the census. Annually, we do surveys for kind of the larger sectors of the economy, such as manufacturers and services and sales and retail trade. Over the course of the RDCs being in existence, they have used administrative data to kind of link businesses over time, establishments and firms. And so the SSEL, or what is called the business register, basically just has an address for every entity that we have data on and tracks those entities over time. The longitudinal business database, which you may have heard of, is an administrative data set that has been constructed by Census to track establishments over time, and also and also try to keep track of who owns those establishments. We have lots of trade data going back to the early 90s. Those are transactional level data. The data set link listed there, referred to as the lifted, that takes actual trade transaction records and links them to firms. And like I said, that goes back to 1992 through roughly the present. When I say that there's always a lag between the years of data that are available and the current year. So, the most recent year available for most of these data sets would be probably 2019, even though we're obviously in 2021. So that would be one thing to keep in mind. Like, you're not going to have like data from last month in these data sets. There's a whole lot more economic data sets. There's a quick example from Matthias Carey at Duke and some co-authors. there's an almost unlimited number of topics you can look at. People do productivity estimates. They gauge how things affect the labor market. I mean, and there's current projects trying to look at the effects of the pandemic on businesses. We do have 2 specific pandemic surveys that began last year. The pulse surveys, there's a household pulse survey and a business pulse survey, and those are available in the RDCs as well. I don't think I have them listed here, but those are basically just asking kind of pandemic related questions about how many people you've hired, how many people you've had to lay off, various things that would have resulted from the pandemic. There's another one from Paige we made from the business school. The LAHD data, like I said, links employers and businesses over time. Ted's actually used these data, Ted Mao, the director on the UNC side of the RDC. And it's been recently used by a recent graduate of Duke, looking at entrepreneurship and local labor markets. It probably makes sense from here. To apply for the census data, let me quickly just say that there's a kind of a detailed proposal process. You have to provide some benefits to the Census Bureau's data collection programs, and that's just kind of a weird legal thing because Census is the legislation that Census operates under doesn't allow it to make these confidential census data sets available to people who are not employees of the Census Bureau. So we get around that by hiring you as an unpaid contractor and telling Census that you're going to, in the course of your research, you're going to provide us a benefit of some sort. And so to do that, you would have to work with me to work on a proposal. And then once you're in, we would go through all the requirements of how to do that. And people like Ted and Daniel can also offer some insight into how that works. But I think from here, it probably just makes sense in the interest of time to just open it up for questions. We only have about 15 minutes left. Let me stop this share.
Thanks, Bert. And if any attendees have any questions, I think I can either unmute you or you can put questions in the chat.
Now, I guess it would behoove me to say to go, if you have questions and you don't feel comfortable asking them now, or it's a specific question tied to a piece of research you're interested in doing, you can just email me or call me or get in touch with me. I'm sure Ted and Daniel feel the same way. Just let us know.
Yeah, this is Ted. I just like to second what Bert said. Be happy to talk by email or chat by Zoom if anybody has any questions and wants to get a perspective on what it's like to work in the data center and apply for access.
Yes, the same here. Please feel free to contact us.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think we can wait a few more minutes to see if there's questions that come through, but if not, thank you everyone for attending, and we're going to go ahead and we'll have the recording up, but encourage people to reach out if they do have questions, and thanks for attending.